This is TWIS. This Week in Science, episode number 965, recorded Wednesday, March 27th, 2024. Science for our future fossils. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Kiki, and tonight on the show, we're going to fill your heads with memories, machine learning, and stinky teens. But first, thanks to our amazing Patreon sponsors for their generous support of TWIS. You can become a part of the Patreon community at patreon.com/thisweekinscience. Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. The future. It is a place of dreams and expectations, a realm of imagination that we create through our choices every day. The future. It's a place of probability and possibility, not a promise. Nothing certain to gain. If we just wait, it will come. Just like This Week in Science, coming up next.
I've got the kind of mind that can't get enough. I want to learn everything. I want to fill it all up with new discoveries that happen every day of the week. There's only one place to go to find the knowledge I seek. I want to know what's happening. What's happening? What's happening this week in science? What's happening? What's happening? What's happening this week in science?
Good science, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Science. We have a great show ahead that I do hope that you fully enjoy. On this week's show, I am joined by paleontologist, futurist, and host of the Future Fossils podcast, Michael Garfield. And if you've been a TWIS fan going back a while, you might also recognize Michael's name from one of the past TWIS science music compilations. So he's also a musician and has been a TWIS contributor for a long time. What was that, 2007?
7.
Yes. Thank you for joining us tonight.
It's a blast. I've been a fan of your show for 19 years. That's the longest. I have friends that are younger than my appreciation for you.
And we are finally connecting on this episode. I mean, we have connected in real life previously, but it's really great to have you on the show to actually talk about some of the things that you're interested, where our interests kind of combine and are collide. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Way to make me feel old. But anyway, instead, I'm going to take it as the good gracious. We are a resilient show, and we are just continuing to bring you science every single week. And as we jump into the show here, everyone, I want to remind you that subscribing to the TWIS podcast is going to get you the podcast edited and wonderful in your ears every single week on whatever platform. If you look for This Week in Science or TWIS, we're also on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch, and we live stream weekly, 8 p.m. Pacific time. We've got, Wednesdays. That's right. It's a Wednesday. I forget everything. Time. It's relative. All the places, look for This Week in Science. We're also on social media, so I do hope that you look for us there. If you have questions, please head over to our website, twis.org. I have lots of stories about brains and machine learning and stinky teens. So, Michael, are you ready to go?
Always.
All
Especially now, yes.
right. Especially now. Let us begin. Let's start with the formation of memories. And honestly, to you all out there, if this story becomes something that you remember, it's because I broke your brain. Or more scientifically, based on the research that has currently been published in the open access Nature journal, actually just today, formation of memory assemblies through the DNA sensing TLR9 pathway. Now, that sounds like a bunch of like bloop, 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 bloop. TLR proteins and genes are toll-like receptors, and there are a number of them, and they are involved in all sorts of processes, and they are very important for interacting with the immune system and kind of creating processes that fix things. And in this particular study, for the first time, researchers actively showed that in the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain in humans, it's like kind of right between your ears in the brainstem area. Um, in birds, which is what I studied, it's like right on top. They like it up on top. But the hippocampus, we know, is very important for the formation of memories, also for navigation and other things. So the hippocampal neurons, we know they respond and they activate certain protein synthesis pathways when things are happening that need to be remembered. But what actually creates the network of neurons that work together to make a memory a memory? The hippocampus is like the bus stop where a memory, information comes in, a memory is kind of put together and packaged, and then it goes out to the rest of the brain for the rest of the brain to store. In this process, though, what these researchers have found is that in an area of the hippocampus called CA1, the neurons that get stimulated during an event actually have double stranded DNA breaks. So their DNA is damaged. And these little tiny pieces of double stranded DNA like rupture and leave the nucleus of the cell. And so there's an inflammatory response. And in this inflammatory response, TLR9, toll like receptor 9, gets activated, and a bunch of DNA repair processes get started. And in this study, they looked at mice, not humans, of course. They weren't looking at people and chopping up DNA in people brains. But in this study, they were able to determine that when they shut off the toll like receptor 9 in mouse brains, the mice didn't remember things. And when they upregulated stuff, then it worked a little bit better. So, in this situation, what we're looking at is the immune system, which isn't really historically been considered very much with respect to the brain. And it's getting a lot more attention more recently. Um, but what we're seeing is a gene and then a protein that also decreases in its abundance as you get older, decreases in its abundance, specifically in people who have Alzheimer's disease. This gene is specifically involved in the cell population that create a network for a specific event, for a memory. And so this is a piece very early in that process of creating the network of neurons that go on to like hold a memory, an association within the brain. I know. I love stuff like this. I know it's like very like nitty gritty. There's a little piece of the puzzle, but there's always been this general question of where are memories stored? How do we remember things? How does that even start? And people talk about networks of neurons and this and that, but suddenly we have a piece of the puzzle and it has to do with damage. Something occurs to damage the DNA in neurons because neurons don't copy themselves, right? The neurons are just there, but there's breakage. And because of the breakage, the immune system gets involved. And the immune system then is part of the process of creating a network of neurons that hold a memory. I don't know. What do you think, Michael?
Well, I mean, this is I haven't followed up on this particular strand, but I remember about a decade ago I read a piece on the what they call the intense world syndrome for autism
Mhm.
spectrum. There was a hypothesis that suggested that certain individuals fall on one end of a distribution of sensitivity to what most people would consider normal childhood stimuli,
Hmm.
and that those people have, there's a kind of a bouquet of symptoms in autism and Asperger's that
Mhm.
they were saying where people's memories were unusually strong because it was like they were being traumatized by normal levels of experience, and that this was related to the differences in the development
Mhm.
of there's like affective empathy, but then there's also an empathy that's more like based on theory of mind due to personal
Mhm.
relationships, and that it was the avoidance of interpersonal contact because of the intensity of relationship that was leading to underdeveloped theory of mind in certain people. But it could be, if those people were raised in an environment where things could be kind of stimuli could be down regulated in their intensity, that they could develop a theory of mind, that it wasn't like it wasn't part of, anyway, like that. This is just like another, when I'm listening to this story, it just kind of makes me think about another thing that they talk about, the relationship between trauma and memory and in the
Mm.
brain, and the relationship
Yeah.
between trauma and inflammatory response,
Yes,
and
stress,
yeah,
and they
so
get stress in the inflammatory response, and so
yeah.
PTSD, and why do certain memories become held so much more strongly in our memory than others? So, yeah, I think you're onto something there, and, Patrick in the YouTube chat is saying, "So anti-inflammatories are bad for memory." Great, and actually, the authors of this study are concerned about some of the, treatments for COVID-19, because some of these treatments do impact the TLR9 pathway. So, there are questions as to, you know, uh, I guess the cost benefit to uh, what we use as anti-inflammatories, how we stimulate or downregulate the immune system, and TLR9. These toll-like receptors. This is number 9, but there's lots of them. So it's not like this is the only one. They're all specifically involved in different functions, but it's uh, yeah, I think it's a very interesting point as to, how individual immune systems are tuned or attuned to certain stimuli and how they respond, and specifically what's going on here. So
Can I
anyway,
ask you a question as far as that
oh,
is concerned?
always. Sure.
So, back when I was still host of Complexity podcast, I interviewed Peter Sheridan Dodds at the University of Vermont, who does time series analytics, or did anyway, time series analytics on Twitter data,
Mm.
and found that something happened in 2020 where uh,
Something.
yes, yes, that
Yeah.
basically people were core, like the sort of formation of linear like serial episodic memory was disrupted in that year,
Mm,
and so people in August were
fascinating.
remembering the second wave of COVID as being kind of closer to the first wave of COVID than in March than they were to the George Floyd and Breonna Parker protests in
Right.
June. And so there was this, there was something like, there was a question about, what maybe remote work had done, because the way that we move through space has a lot to do with the way that we form and deposit memory. So
Mhm.
when people are no longer moving and they're stuck in front of a computer all the time, then the proximity of different experiences in time changes and becomes
Yep.
more about other ways of traversing a network,
Yeah.
it becomes more like kind of poetic or associative. But anyway, it's just funny because now, the whole time I was thinking, oh, it's just because everybody spends all their time on the computers now that we're remembering things differently. But it's like, oh, but I also got the jab that year, so who knows? How would you as as an experimental design, how would you begin to try and like tease apart those possible causal factors Like, how could you even do that? I guess you'd have to do it in mice, and it wouldn't
Well,
be
there's been a
very.
lot of work in mice already because mice spend a lot of their time in a single environment, right? Their lab cage or crate or wherever they are. And there's been a lot of what research into what are called place cells. And so in the hippocampus, we have these particular cells that are called place cells that recognize or are stimulated by particular places or when place changes. So there are, like there are certain cells that the media popped into for pop psychology that are like, oh, face cells. It's the celebrity cells, where your visual system goes, hey, I know that person. They're Queen Elizabeth or whatever. In the hippocampus, as a navigational organ within our brain, this population of neurons are stimulated by our changes in location and very specific locations. And so there are certain cells that respond to, I'm in my studio, still, 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 and the habituation takes place. And so habituation of neurons is a very big deal because when neurons habituate, they pretty much stop firing. And so you don't have responses in the same way. There has been some literature to the effect that when we change rooms, like go through a doorway or make a particular movement these place cells, particular ones become active, and it is then like a new chapter in a book because they mark a time and a place. And there are timekeeping cells that are based on our circadian rhythm and are specifically like frequency based, and they fire very regularly. And so they fire in a particular way that synchronizes then with the place cell. So you have your brain then completely marking a spot. It's like when you're doing an audio recording or a video recording and you want to mark the audio and video at the same time, and you tell the person who's on camera to clap, or you have the little click clap board. Um, so our brain does this automatically, and we know this because of work that we've done in mice and other animals. We expect that people have place cells, and it's only going to be through the use of, I think, like video games and fMRI, where we can image the brain as people are doing particular behaviors. Maybe some of the more portable brain recording devices will be able to get. It's just the resolution is not high enough at this point in time, but yeah, that's kind of where we want to be. Is you know starting to look at experiments that can measure the brain's activity when you're in place versus the brain's activity when you're moving versus the brain's activity when you know where you're expected to go versus the brain's activity when you find when you turn a corner and find a surprise, where you are lost perhaps. I don't know. I always thought so. Burning Man person to Burning Man person. I always thought that it would be fun to take an fMRI machine out to Burning Man and measure people before the city was built, while the city was built, and then after the city was being like when the city was being torn down, and figure out a way to determine how their brain responded to the change in locational cues.
Yeah,
Because
and also
it's a
Friday
week.
night when they tear down all the street signs as a
Yeah,
joke.
exactly. The street signs
Yeah.
come down, the man comes down. The navigation is then your points of reference are completely lost. So anyway, that's kind of I've had this idea for a long time, but getting an fMRI machine out to Burning Man isn't necessarily going to be feasible. So we'll work something out.
Give it 5 years. Maybe you wouldn't thought that, bringing 2,000 drones out to Burning Man would have been feasible either, but there you go.
There you
Anyway,
go. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Still brainy for the beginning of the show. This is another big, exciting study out of Dresden University of Technology, published in EMBO Journal. And this study used two things that I absolutely love, looking at the brain and organoids. So, brain organoids are these mix of cell types that are cultured within the lab to allow the cells to develop in a way that is naturally mimicking development of the human brain. And so, uh, there's this question, what is it that allows us to be human? Everybody thinks it's our neocortex, right? We have our ancient brain, our ancestral brain, primitive brain that is emotional, but then all of our logic and uh, the all of the things that are more reason based take place in the cortex, or what's called the neocortex. And this area of the brain has lots of neurons. It lets you be creative. It allows us to talk to each other. Neocortex is it's part of the brain that grows and becomes enfolded. And we have all the foldy ridges in the primate brain, whereas mice and bird brains are totally smooth. So, why is that? Um, and these researchers used organoids to try and figure out what might be responsible. And in their study, they looked at genetic factors that might be involved in brain expansion and allowing the stem cells, or those precursors to the neocortex, the cells that grow into those neurons, to grow more in primates and grow less in mice. And they used this organoid technology, and in what they developed, they found that there is a particular growth factor called epiregulin. And epiregulin is essential to primate and human neocortical stem cell growth. So again, they looked at the mouse brain, and in their cultures, they were like, oh, look, if we give them epiregulin, their brain neocortex grows a little bit more. And then they were like, but wait, what about human cells? Oh, look, human cells, if we give them epiregulin, nothing really happens. Oh, let's look at another primate. Let's look at gorillas, of course. And so they looked at gorillas, and they determined that when gorillas, which normally have less epiregulin than humans, were given more epiregulin, they had more growth in their neocortex. So, epiregulin, there's kind of like a limit, and it seems like humans are at that limit where we don't need any more, but other primates could potentially have more epiregulin, and their neocortex could grow further. So, neocortex, very important according to our hypotheses of human creativity, ability to interact, all these things. And this one factor, this growth factor in this particular study, uh, suggests that it is a limiting factor to the brain, the neocortex, and those abilities in other primates, but not in humans. We've got enough, apparently. Do you have enough?
I never feel like I have enough. Well, like, okay, so this
More.
provokes two questions, right? One, at least two. It provokes two in
At
my
least,
the
at
brain with
least.
as many folds as I have. One of which is uh, so like if you and maybe I'm making a kind of foolish assumption here, but like if you think about uh, the like fractal networks and the scaling of fractal networks,
Mhm,
and like a koala's brain is very smooth, a koala's life is very simple. If you think about intelligence as a response to environmental complexity, in at least
mhm,
in the organisms that manage to survive, uh, you know uh, by internalizing and being able to model the complexity of their environment. So you get human evolution is full of these interesting feedbacks and kind of chicken egg stories between uh, our intensely social existence and our language and the complexity of our language and our individual intelligence and the complexity of our culture. And so, it's just curious. It's like, okay, so we have more epiregulin than a gorilla.
Yep.
But the epiregulin came from somewhere. So what
Mice
was it?
have it, so
Yeah.
it is something that is a growth factor that is conserved. It is involved in the development of certain neurons and certain parts of, the neocortex in mammals generally. Yeah. So why did its levels change? What
Well,
happened?
more even more than that, like, often these features, some trait is exapted, like it evolved somewhere else first, and then it gets repurposed. And so, just idle question would be, where do we actually see epiregulin emerge on the tree of life, and is it being used for this where it first
Elsewhere.
appears, or
Yeah.
was it used for something else? And then the next question is kind of
Mhm.
like, well, if we are at our limit, how much does the fact that we've kind of hit the asymptote of what epiregulin can do for us, what does that have to do with the kind of
Limits of
pernicious, like the fact that we outboard so much of our individual cognition into diverse niches within a complex society, and out like writing and like all these other ways that we extend cognition into our environments, you know
but
anyway.
that's an ability that is allowed because of our sensory system and our neocortex, and yeah, and we'll talk about a body embodiment and how that all works in a little bit. We're going to get back to that topic because I like this topic. Embodiment is very important to me. But yeah, I think it is. Your questions, I think, are right on track because what is the what are species differences in this particular growth factor, the gene expression, and when and where does it exist, and how is it expressed, and why? So yeah, what are we gonna do with this information if humans can't use it? Are we going to go like what is it, the Uplift series, Sundiver? Give it to the dolphins? Give it, I don't. What are we doing? And maybe it's Douglas Adams, and the mice will rule everything eventually. But
Well, yeah,
yes,
George Dvorsky of IO9 talks about animal uplift a lot. And yeah, it's like maybe we're at that point where like Interspecies Internet Initiative, interspecies.io, they're trying to do the machine learning to communicate with non-humans. It's like, well, maybe a dolphin, or maybe not a dolphin, but yeah, maybe a gorilla or a raven ends up upregulating this growth factor in order to adapt to a more complex technological environment. We just start seeing it happen,
yeah,
or maybe we
I
do
think,
it.
or maybe we do it. Maybe we force it through. I don't know. But humans, we change our environment all the time. We like to fix things and make lots of changes, which is why researchers want to make beer better. Of course, there's always improvements in beer that can be made, I guess. Researchers, again, publishing in Nature Communications Open Access, their study using machine learning, creating a model that they have an algorithm that was their best performing algorithm called gradient boosting, that was able to take the information from 180,000 consumer reviews to be trained, and also have 200 chemical properties, quantitative, descriptive, sensory information, and outperform some of like the leading ways of deciding how beer should be made and should taste. So in this study, they say, ta-da! Our study reveals how big data and machine learning uncover complex links between food chemistry, flavor, and consumer perception, and lays the foundation to develop novel, tailored foods with superior flavor. Is AI going to make beer better? Is this is this is this where we're going now?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I love talking with like the microbiologists who are like, I'm going to work with all of the yeast strains and make new yeast strains and do this. Oh, we'll fix all of the stuff. But perhaps this is now going to be the way that these microbiologists work with artificial intelligence to be able to change aspects of the yeast and the fermentation process and the other ingredients that
There will
make.
be a Spotify algorithm for beer.
Oh,
It'll create a
geez.
beer playlist tailored to your genome.
Oh no. You're just gonna end up like again, you're gonna get stuck in a box. You'll never taste anything new. I mean, although I don't like beer that has a banana flavor. It's not really my thing, but that's just me. But I wouldn't know that if I hadn't tried it. So all the algorithms. I don't
We
know.
can get to that later. Yeah, it's a serious thing.
We can get to it later. So much putting off until later. Yes, the big question here though is, or uh, the reality is this is harnessing machine learning, taking human sensory data and opinion, you know, it's not objective, right? It's subjective. And it's putting it together in large databases along with um, other chemical information that can be cross correlated because of the algorithms that they're using. Not all, and also, as this showed, they used 10 different algorithms to test, and only one was the best.
What this doesn't
Which,
include is a kind of evolutionary game theoretical component because, like, if we were to instrumentalize this in some sort of, consumer optimization implementation, people would adapt to it. You'd get this sort of economic, um, people would start they would become hipsters that are actively rejecting the algorithmically designed beer. They would they
yeah,
would they would demand human beer, and so you'd get some sort of arms race resulting in an equilibrium where, like there's a sufficiently large population of people that are deliberately drinking bad beer,
it's
you know?
like Portland.
Exactly.
Everything's artisanal here. Yes. You only come here because you love the artistry. Oh my goodness. Okay, moving forward in this, this has nothing to do with machine learning, but you're a parent, yes, Michael?
I don't have teenagers yet, so I'm lucky
No,
that my house still smells well, I don't know, they got diapers. It's only
but
getting
babies.
better.
This is this
Yes.
is this is the story, right? Babies, they smell nice, and teenagers, they start to smell smelly and uh, less nice. So there's a point between babyhood, around 3 years old or so, and that early preteen teenageriness, and there's a change in how the offspring smell. And as a parent of a 13-year-old boy child, I can attest to the fact that he's wonderful, but boy child 13 is different. Um, it doesn't smell like the baby anymore. Researchers just published in Communications Chemistry their study looking at body odor samples. They took little pad things and stuck them in the armpits of babies up to 3 years old, and also uh, teenagers up to about 18 years of age, 14 to 18. And then these cotton pads were collected, analyzed with mass spectroscopy, gas chromatography. They identified chemical compounds. And then they also had the peoples sniffing the odors and assessing what was happening. Um, and And this is my favorite part of this particular study is that not we know body odors change. Number one, you are not responsible for your body odor. The microbes on your body are responsible for your body odor. So this is indicative of the fact that the exterior microbiome of a human being is changing during development as a result of certain factors that affect from the interior to the exterior. Might just be that, teenagers don't shower as much. I don't know. Um, but I love this where they determined that the babies had certain things in common, certain chemicals in common, but there were certain compounds that were specifically found in pubertal children, post puberty. Squalene specifically is one of the chemicals that has been characterized in this particular study, and adults telling telling the researchers what they thought they smelled. They refer to teenagers as musky, cheesy, goat-like in odor, whereas babies are sweet like candy.
I mean, this is to the the kind of a trope in ecology that a lot of populations are age partitioned. That there's I don't know if that's actually what's going on here, but you could argue that there's resource competition and that there's this whole thing about
Oh,
you know the adults
ooh, I love
kicking
that.
their teenagers
Yes.
out of the house. And so maybe I mean, but it's like question like teenagers smell good to each other, of course, right? Like
Or they don't
they're at
notice
that
it.
point
They
where they're
smell
starting to
fine.
form
Yeah.
their own kin group, like, I mean, out of kin group affiliations,
Mhm.
right? So it's like, well, you want your baby to smell good because that baby needs you, but by the time they're a teenager, it's like, well, go pay for your own lunch.
And I think that is one of the very interesting, items that the researchers are thinking about is, what does this change in odor have to do with kind of that external manipulation of parents and caregivers? And so it's possible that they wanna do work further to understand the impact of these odors, the goat-like odors
I mean, so the
on
thing that
parents.
concerns me about studies like this, they're talking about it in the chat here. The thing that concerns me is like, this question of why. If
Mhm.
Justin were here, he would be like, "Why did they do this study? We know teens smell," uh, and the answer is probably right that they. I mean, it even says so in the Phys.org report.
Mhm.
That they're. We might be able to. It might prove fruitful for makers of odor control products. So, of course, this is like
Right,
paid for by the deodorant industry. But then you get into
right.
these questions with artificial fragrances, which is like with artificial hormones. It's like, well, this is disrupting an important channel of communication that we're taking. That like this is doing something. Like Chesterton's fence. Maybe you shouldn't
Mhm.
get rid of the fence until you know why it's there. Maybe we shouldn't
Exactly,
have
yes.
the teenagers around. Maybe we're supposed to kick them out of the house.
That's the whole thing, individuation and that separation from the parents, that is something that takes place during those teen years, and it is, not necessarily just behavioral, it could also be metabolic and physiological as well. Yes. Oh, the smells we smell, the things it could be a Dr. Seuss book. 2 more studies for the first part of the show to go. Researchers have been looking at the ability of tardigrades to survive harsh stresses, environmental stresses like outer space, and just very drying out, during drought periods. Tardigrades have genes that allow their bodies to survive all sorts of things. And previously, researchers have shown that they have these these proteins that can create kind of like a hydrogel, or they create like a matrix within the tardigrades that changes the tardigrade metabolism, and allows them to go into the what's called their ton state, or like a biostasis, and they that is a place they can stay almost indefinitely until the conditions allow them to be revived. These researchers who just published in the journal Protein Science from the University of Wyoming, they took human embryonic kidney cells and they put this tardigrade protein into the human kidney cells, and were able to show that these human kidney cells, the protein, so when the human cells were exposed to the stresses, the tardigrade protein created the matrix in the hydrogel. They created the fibers inside of the cell. Um, and it also slowed metabolism within the cell. And then those human cells, it could be reversed and the cells could be revived. So I'm obviously thinking like, oh my gosh, this is like cryostasis. Like this is our century ships and other things. We're going to use tardigrade science to genetically modify ourselves so that our bodies can go into a biostasis and then be restored at the end of this point in time. Right now, of course, this is in in vitro. What is it? Is it in vitro? Anyway, it's in the cells in a dish. It's not in vivo in living organisms. But the cells that have the proteins, they go into biostasis. They're resistant to stress, and the cells can return to normal metabolism afterwards. So, anyway, tardigrades solving humans' space cryostasis problems, maybe?
Are you
What
familiar with the science fiction of Peter Watts? He was
you-
one of these great guys, trained as a biologist, and then went on to write some of the most like
I love,
insane
yeah.
sci-fi. And he starts his book Blind Sight with exactly this kind of passage. He says, you wake. He's talking about somebody who's been on a long space mission. You wake in an agony of resurrection, gasping after a
Mhm.
record-shattering bout of sleep apnea spanning 140 days. You can feel your blood syrupy with dobutamine and leuencephalin forcing its way through arteries shriveled by months on standby. Yeah, he's right there with you. Like
Yeah.
let's realize this.
So in this case, it's a compound that's called CAHSD, and that is these tardigrades intrinsically disordered proteins. So CAHS proteins. They can form these hydrogels. But yeah, this is the D form specifically from the tardigrade seems to be similar to the compound that Watts was describing in that science fiction intro. Yeah, you probably wouldn't feel great to revive after something like this.
No, I mean that's why he loves this
Impossible.
like horror. It's horror. It's a horror story. Yeah.
Yeah, so CAHS is cytoplasmic abundant heat soluble proteins. So they're heat soluble, able to survive desiccation, and can also precondition cells to survive drying. And in this particular state, water loss would be very important. So I would imagine that, ooh, I don't think people would enjoy it very much, but I don't know. Maybe this is first, not century ships and going to space, but maybe preservation of organs so that we can deal with some of the issues of organ transplantation. Maybe there's a way that we can allow organs to survive longer before they're able to get to people who need them. Maybe this is there are a lot of potential aspects for understanding what exactly this is going to lead to. But I don't know. I love tardigrades. They're they survive all sorts of stuff. We're puny humans.
We're also not half a millimeter long, so they can get away with all kinds of stuff that we can't, just because of the size. And there's that great quote about, if you throw a rat down the well, it bounces. If you throw a human, he breaks. And if you throw a horse, it splashes.
Ew. Thanks for that.
Yeah, we were kind of already there, but yeah.
Auditory visuals. Ah. Oh my goodness. So I said two more stories, but that was it for my stories for the start of the show. Unless you want to keep going on our tardigrade human future. All right, everyone. This is This Week in Science. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get into a deep dive in just a moment here, but I do want to remind all of you that if you're enjoying the show, please share the show with people you think might like it. Share it with a friend today. The link's right there. Send it out. Copy, paste, send. It's easy. Also, subscribe if you haven't. Click the notifications and the little bell buttons. Make sure you're subscribed. Um, and if you're already there, the other place you can go is twist.org. Click on the Patreon link to support us through our Patreon. $10 per month and more will get you thanked at the end of the show by name. I read a long list of names. It's a thing. I get to name you after the show. It's great. Also, we have merchandise in our Zazzle store, and a portion of those receipts of those purchases do go to support the show and keeping everything going, the back end of the websites and all the things. If you love TWIS, help us out. Let's keep going. Thank you for your support. We really cannot do this without you. Okay, we're going to come back right now for more This Week in Science. And I do want to reintroduce our guest tonight. For this episode, Michael Garfield is a paleontologist, futurist, host of the Future Fossils podcast, a writer, a musician, visual artist, public speaker, and oh my goodness, so much more. His mind is a whirlwind of chaotic connections, envisioning the future from the knowledge of today. And as his About page states, following will lead to a kaleidoscopic avalanche of explorations into human technology coevolution, the pre and post history of creativity and communication, and other soulful and subversive, I like subversive futurism. Michael, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. This was one of the first podcasts I ever listened to back when I was drawing frogs for 4 hours a day in the herpetology wing of the University of Kansas Natural History Museum. The best job I ever had.
That sounds
Stippling
like
frogs and listening to you.
Oh, sounds like a great combination. I mean, I love frogs. Blair loves frogs as well. So that would be wonderful. But you've moved on from drawing frogs, and you're not only a podcast host. And as the intro here that I've just made states, like you are very multi-talented and into all sorts of things. But what I've seen from you and your posts on social media and the podcasts that you've hosted is that you are really constantly on the edge, the bleeding edge of philosophical exploration. I think that would be really challenging for a lot of people psychologically. And I just would love to know what drew you to this intersection of humanity, technology, and the future.
Well, I mean, the profusion of hyphens in that description, I think ought to be just like a flag basically stating that I'm kind of a textbook schizotypal weirdo, high noise brain. You said it yourself, chaotic brain. David Krakauer, the president of the Santa Fe Institute, but when I still worked there, called me a high temperature in the sense of like simulated annealing,
I love
so
that.
there's a
High
phase.
temperature.
Yeah, I think that I've been thinking a lot about this because I'm very fascinated about the anthropology of science. Like what kinds of people get into a given discipline, and there's always a split. I mean, this isn't just true of science. This is true of really any kind of human pursuit, and the precise balance probably varies. Like if you're an accountant, you probably are more likely to have a more conservative neurophysiology, but in in the sciences, there are people that are drawn to parsimonious explanatory heuristics. Like these are the people that want the equation on a t-shirt. And then there are people that are
Break it
drawn to
down. Yeah.
consilience. They want the conspiracy theory wall with all of the connections between everything. And I think that, generally speaking, every human society is a is some kind of distribution of these two different neurotypes, and that they uh, that depending on the like the stability of the environment, like the environmentally regular features, uh, the pace at which the environment changes, that you either end up with more of one or the other, and so you always have like a reservoir of variation in the population, so that when things are crazy like they are now historically, uh, things swing somewhat back in the direction of generalists, and you see a movement in the sciences uh, from like most of the last 350 years was more about predictive kind of thinking, and now we've moved out of like a Newtonian regime and into a regime where a lot more science is being done, and more all the time, in simulations and in evolutionary models. And so these are like we've gotten to a point where a huge area of science is about systems that are complex and adaptive, and their behaviors are emergent, and they can't be predicted from a linear dynamical model. And I think that, so this is the kind of science that attracts me. This is the kind of topic that I find fascinating, and this is why I think, yeah, I mean, it is like we were talking about earlier about like stress in the brain and learning. I am a lifelong learner. I think lifelong learning is favored by the conditions of our rapidly changing world in a way that it might not have been 300 years ago. And maybe 300 years ago I would have ended up in a mental asylum, and now I'm a podcaster. So
I don't think that's true. But yeah, I think, I mean, our anyway, length of life, evolution, all that stuff is a completely different conversation as to how our brains and everything are set up to develop. But um, anyone who was not ready to be a lifelong learner evolutionarily was set up to die from not learning from their mistakes. So, and not able, if they're not able to learn from your environment and ask more questions and adapt to new situations, uh, that's not survive. You're not on a survival trajectory there. So anyway, podcaster versus dead fossil, or insane asylum. It's not podcasting that keeps you pushing the envelope and asking new questions. I mean, I see you bringing all these things up. But, like, you bring up modeling, and as somebody who comes from the sciences and experimental sciences at that, I see there being a balance where intrinsically there needs to be modeling, but experimentalism is always going to give us the evidence that can support the theory. The theory, the simulations in a computer are, the computer is never going to be the Earth. We're never going to be, Douglas Adams, the answer is 42. The planet was a computer that was simulating a planet. No, it's we don't have that capability at this point in time. And do you think the modeling is enough, and just having the ideas to push forward and keep pushing the questions is what keeps you going?
I mean, in my case, I I basically what happened was I went to school for evolutionary biology as a means of getting into vertebrate paleontology and doing paleontological field work. And that is a very
Brushing off
uh,
fossils.
yeah, I mean, that's a very grounded, like literally grounded, earthy, not cheesy, musty, but
Yeah, yeah.
you're kind of a goat. Um, that is, that's a very tactile and tangible science, or at least it was. Interestingly, paleontology is one of these domains that's actually gone more and more into biophysical simulations and computer modeling in terms of understanding the physiology and ecology of extinct organisms. But at any rate, that's just what's hot right now, right? Let's the beer AI. Um, but I think that what
Seriously.
happened to me was that I read a series of papers in my final year of undergraduate study that got me thinking about much deeper questions, in particular, papers about the evolution of syntactic language and about the evolutionarily sustainable or stable strategies, rather. So, like,
Mhm.
the way that
ESSs, man.
yeah, that lying persists in a population
Yeah.
because, there's a threshold below which the frequency of lying doesn't overwhelm the, the it doesn't create so much noise that the signal flips and people, like people's the recipients start interpreting it differently. So, like, I started thinking about, I started seeing these, what I came later to understand were papers about error thresholds and criticality and phase transitions. And I was like, my God, this
Mm,
is not something that I can study by digging up bones. And I started asking my graduate, like the people that would have been my graduate advisors had I gone on at that time, how I can start asking these big questions about the evolution of intelligence and its relationship to the evolution of language. And they strongly discouraged me from going into grad school making it like out of the closet with this stuff. This was 2005. They were saying, don't do this because your graduate advisor is going to want you to bite off a very small, manageable question. And
right.
this kind of, highly consilient, synthetic kind of thing is the thing that then more so than now, but it's still I think still on average the case that this is the kind of thing that's reserved for people that are later in their careers.
Yes,
And
bigger
you,
questions. Exactly. You can do the bigger studies after you're emeritus, but when you're a
right,
graduate student, just do the nitty-gritty. Answer the little
right,
questions, get your dissertation done, move on to a postdoc, learn how it all works, and just make it happen.
right.
And
So I
do
was
what
just
your
so
yeah, do what your PI says.
yeah, and that broke my heart. Actually, is what happened. It broke my
Oh,
heart so
I'm so
profoundly
I'm so
that I
sad.
left academia after 22 years of having no other plan for myself than to
Right.
become a paleontology professor. And
Oh,
I ended up just sort of roving around. There are the Ronin, right? Like there are. It's interesting, like
oh,
as the
now you're
world.
going into
Well,
right.
like there's more room in the intellectual world now for this kind of thing. For unaffiliated, independent scholars, or for people that exist kind of in between academia and private research, or like the ecosystem has become more diverse, and I think in part because, like we were talking about brain complexity a little earlier. The whole system is more complex than it was 20 years ago, and so
Mhm.
more diversity, more niches, more opportunities have opened up. And but at the time, I just ended up basically living this question, which is, now what do I do? Who am I? What am I if not a dinosaur scientist?
Oh my
And
gosh, you're, like,
and
telling
then
me about my life right now.
right, you're in a very similar position,
Who
right? Like
am I? Yeah.
yeah. So living the question, I'm a big fan of the technologist and author Kevin Kelly, and he has a book about trends
Yeah, he's
in
great.
technology called The Inevitable. And one of the 12 trends that he discusses in that book, I've had him on Future Fossils 3 times, and we talk about this, is that, he says that in an age of cheap compute and easily accessible search, that answers are cheap. That we have this extraordinary
Mhm.
trove of network knowledge now. The hard part is learning to navigate that overwhelming surfeit of information. And so what has turned out is that as information, Herbert Simon actually talked about this in the 1970s. He said, what does information consume? It consumes attention. And so when we have a lot of information, we have a poverty of attention. And that proved to be incredibly prophetic. And so what we have now is a situation where answers are cheap and questions are valuable. And so like this is why I am the way I am. And I think probably the way you are is something to do with this. It's like both of us are, and I imagine a lot of people listening recognize that uh, and I have a pinned post on my Twitter account, depending on when you listen to this, about this exact thing. It's like if you want to read a book will give
Mhm.
you an extraordinarily uh, distilled answer. Most books are at a phase in the life cycle of knowledge production where an enormous amount of work has gone into uh, bringing something to a general audience and making something ready for book publishing, for market dynamics, and it's shaped in a particular way that makes the knowledge as accessible as possible. So it's kind of like pre-digestion, and then if you think
Yeah.
about like knowledge production as a social metabolism of information management, that the podcast exists at a kind of on the opposite pole of this process. It's bringing listeners into the the moment that ideas are formed, the moment that
Yeah.
hypotheses are proposed. In conversation, we have this much larger surface area of recombinant, noisy possibility and exploration. And so I don't think it's a surprise that you and I find ourselves living the question and discovering that in living the question, we're drawn to conversation as a professional pursuit.
Yeah, I find this yeah, I hate the word resonating, but I am resonating with what you're saying right now. But a few things that you brought up just in the last couple of minutes. A study 2 weeks ago out of Nature Human Behavior researchers actually calling information overload a danger to humanity, the same way that air pollution and other uh, water pollution and other pollutions in our environment are. And there was a study just this week that I didn't bring up, related to uh, our our society's divergence to its two poles, and it's not just the political aspect of where we've ended up because of um, how we've been pushed certain ways and manipulated certain ways. It's also the fact that in our human psyche, we want to find information that agrees with what we already believe. And that is what is already our identity. And so when people provide that, that becomes a point of divergence. And so here we have, social media, podcasting, videos, all the things. Um, People now, with this overload of information, can choose their own adventure, yet the adventure they're choosing is the adventure that they already want to be in. So,
Yeah. Actually, it's funny because I just recently saved this because I thought it was so beautiful. I saved a screenshot of Pearl Rose, who I don't know Pearl Rose from anyone, but this my friend shared this tweet. She said, "What we really need now are content destroyers." It's like
ah,
this, and so
yes,
you think about this sort of
yes.
cognition aspect, and there are all of these trade-offs uh, in neurophysiology about how much information the brain is actually letting into conscious awareness,
Right,
and
we're
this
only
question.
supposed to have certain number of neurons, certain amount of stimuli per moment. We can only have 150 people that we know, but we know so many more. There's all this stuff about what we can handle psychologically, yet we are beyond that. I don't want to be a disruptor like Silicon Valley Like, everybody wants to be a disruptor. I'm gonna disrupt it. This blah, blah, blah. You disrupt an ecosystem and everything freaking dies, okay? Stop it. But I
Right.
wanna be like a fungus. I wanna be a content fungus, and my mycelium is gonna go through and digest stuff and make it better for things to grow.
That's exactly it. Actually, I mean, what you're touching on now is probably the principal exploration or inquiry for Future Fossils podcast, because it's where like all of my curiosity has pooled, is into this question of, what does it mean to live through an event like this, a crisis of information scaling. The closest analogy that anyone I know can come up with is the printing press, although that was an event that had at the a slower and kind of more geographically limited
Radio.
thing. Yeah, but
Radio,
I
the
mean,
phone, the telephone, where
right,
suddenly
but
people could
radio was regulated a whole lot more effectively
but the
than the
telephone,
printing
like, there
press
used
was.
yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm just bringing things up right now because,
Right,
like,
right,
I
right,
feel
right.
like television, the radio, yes, regulated, but people used to have, like, party lines where, the telephones were all connected, and it was like a chat room, and people could pick up the phone, everybody could talk together from their different houses
It's
about
funny that you
what they were watching on TV or listening to on the radio, like
Yeah, that particular example is really good because we it didn't take long for people to figure out that that's not a sustainable model for communication, that's entirely too noisy. And it reminds me of the story that a science fiction author, Annalee Newitz, who also has written a number of really
I
excellent
love
science
Annalene.
nonfiction books.
I love her.
Annalee talks about this on Doug Rushkoff's Team Human podcast, brings up the early days of cafe culture in Europe
Yeah.
and how people had to learn how to have conversations with one another while in the room with other people that were having conversations with one another, that it was unmanageable by people that were upon whom cafe culture had been thrust by history. And we're in a kind of a similar thing now, although I think kind of like the epiregulan
Mm.
thing, it's like we have definitely reached our limit as organisms. And now the question is, how do we
Adapt.
redesign the built environment, or do we have to make intentional modifications to the human organism? And I think, like I'm fairly conservative as far as my transhumanism is concerned. Like I don't like tampering with things I don't understand. I was actually Ian Malcolm of Jurassic Park uh, was ostensibly a researcher at the Santa Fe Institute, and I spent 5 years there, and I wear all black, and I grew up loving that book. And I very much feel like I started out wanting to be Alan Grant and ended up Ian Malcolm. And
Mhm.
now I'm sitting here writing another book now on how do we adapt to a situation where people love to say the genie's out of the bottle, but I think the Raptors are out of the park. And so now the question that we have with these
Yeah.
these concerns about human technology coevolution are akin to the question that was processed for us in a pop cultural frame when over the 6 Jurassic World movies, you see raptors go from a monster to a kind of an ally or comrade or collaborator. So what does it
I mean,
mean
they're
to move
birds.
to a
Come on.
right? Right. They're very smart. Like, Blue the Velociraptor is in a relationship of respect and coordination with Owen Grady, the trainer. I don't really care for those most recent movies, but I do like the way that they trace a kind of a dialectical arc that is useful for us as an analogy for how the way that it might benefit us to start thinking about technology as as a horse and rider or hawk and trainer, rather
Yeah.
than human versus T-Rex rampaging through San Diego.
Yeah. So, side note, other study that came out this week, super cool. Japanese tits, they flutter their wings, and kind of it's like a behavioral body language communication. So speaking of like your interest in communication and other animals and how that has adapted, Flutter say, "Hey, babe, you go first. That's okay. I make way for you." So these Japanese little birds, they communicate using body language by fluttering their wings and talk to each other without using their voices. So body language has been important and is important ongoing. So I think this, going back to the raptors and of the pre bird, right, pre avian ancestry, um, also gets into this question of where are we on the scale of our future and our interaction with where our future is going to go. Obviously, we're a part of our environment and creating it, co-creating it. A lot of organisms aren't necessarily that we know of aware of their part in creating the environment that they live in. We are at a point where we're looking around going, dude, this is messed up. Um, and we can also look at a lot of the technology that we are taking part in, social media, a whole bunch of things, and going, it's not working right. It was kind of going, but now it's, why isn't the internet doing what we wanted it to do? And I feel like we're getting tech companied and marketed down into funnels to act certain ways and do certain things, and people's agency is being taken away from them. So where, like, how, I don't know. I don't know what my question is here, other than how do you feel about this co-creation of the technology that is going to impact our lives and our future generations?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just say that if this is a question that interests people, please do go into the back catalog of Future Fossils because I've spent the last 8 years
Yes.
prosecuting this particular thing. And again, like like I write about it on Substack, and I've written an enormous amount about this
I love it. I
on
love. I saw
Medium.
your Substack. It's so great. It's like
Oh,
interactive
thank
and got
you.
all sorts of. I was like, wow, that's not a normal Substack. I was very
Oh,
excited
and
by your
also,
Substack, and oh my god, the person who did your Ask a Few Future Fossils thing.
right.
I have been. I asked. I want to do this for TWIS. I
So
have
Van
over
Betauer,
20 years of whatever. This is after show, but anyway,
absolutely do this. Well,
tangent.
I mean, this
Okay.
is actually a perfect example of what I'm talking about here, which is that a wonderful listener, a Future Fossils Van Betauer, wrote a conversational interface for the corpus, the training. He trained a machine learning model on over 200 episodes of my show, and then you can ask it a question. And people are concerned about the quality of the information that they get if you, for instance, ask ChatGPT a science question, right? Like you should be concerned because what a lot of these generative AI systems are doing is creating something whole cloth based on probabilistic associations in the training data and giving you something that's made from noise, and it is carrying biases through, and you have no way of auditing the model to understand how it's forming these statistical correlations. And
Right. And I
so
think
like,
that's a huge point to make is they're not generative, they're probabilistic.
right.
That is
So
that's the
yes.
distinction. But anyway,
So
go ahead.
it's funny because I think in a way, it's a good thing that society right now is having a real rubber hits the road encounter with statistics at scale right now. That like people are realizing that what it means that correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but there is a whole class of language models, uh, retrieval augmented generative models actually will still link to the primary sources that they were trained from. And so you can get answers. When you go to askfuturefossils.com, you can get an answer that speaks the way that I speak,
Which is
by the
wild.
way that you speak, right? It was like we've been trained through years of science communication to link our sources. And so, you may think that the source material is biased. I mean, I certainly am biased like everyone. But
By interest, by, like, all of where you came from, all sorts of
right,
things.
but
Yes.
what the model is doing is giving you a reasonable approximation, not only of what the the 8 years of this show can tell you about a particular topic, but it's also pointing you back to the specific 25-second timestamp that he did he's like, this is all like modeled in chunks. And so you can he when you ask it a question, it will give you
This.
the code. And
I
this is
want
such a big
this.
deal. Like, I just got an email today
It's
that
so
was
cool.
advertising build a full stack web application that uses retrieval augmented generation to chat with your data. And this is, this is to your question that you asked a few minutes ago. Like, this
Mhm.
is, I think, um, this is an important way that human beings are going to be able to adapt to the profusion of new information, is because obviously, like, when I'm talking to somebody on social media and they answer one of my questions by linking to a 4-hour podcast, I'm kind of like, well, thanks, buddy. Like, tell me which 30 seconds I need to listen to, because we're all impoverished for time and attention. It's not fair.
I
Don't
want
do that to me.
Come on, I
But
want
with this
everybody to
thing,
be here for the whole hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, however long it takes. Come on. No.
right. I mean, when I found out that people were listening to uh, my podcast for SFI on 2x, I was like, but actually most of them were telling me that they couldn't because we talked too fast and we linked to too many interesting sources. Anyway, like, the thing is that I think my mind works in the way that late former MIT historian William Irwin Thompson, who's one of my great inspirations as a thinker and as a knowledge artist. He called, he talked about his rhetorical technique. He called it Wissenskunst, which is, German for knowledge art, as opposed to Wissenschaft, which is uh, their word for science, not, knowledge craft. And knowledge art, he said, was his replacement for the linear path traversed through information that is characteristic of a traditional university lecture. He said, we
Mm,
live in a networked age. We live in an
mm,
age defined by chaotic and complexity dynamics. And therefore, the way that we encode salient features of this age is by speaking in a way that performs the complexity and the network's nature of our knowledge. And so this is what the future fossils AI is doing, and is what I've made a point of doing in the show that since we started. And I think it's why the AI does such a good job of answering questions in a way that I can approve of. And I
mm.
think I think
You
that this
have
is
to approve of it before you let
right.
it out in the wild,
I mean,
right?
we haven't really stress tested it. I haven't asked it if it can tell my grandma how to make a bomb. But, like, this, I mean, that's what, people are
Now
web
somebody
tuning these things.
will. We'll put a
Right.
link to it. We'll
But
put
I
a
don't
link
have
to it.
that information in the show.
Yeah.
I didn't scrape the entire internet for this. And I think that that's a huge piece of this. It's like, you know, th-
This
um,
is its own database. It is its
right,
own little its world that is the
right.
conversations with specific individuals and the resources and, the references that it goes back to, the things that you've written as well. So it's all content you've created. Um, I mean, this is we can
This is a
create these
content
worlds.
destroyer. This
Yes.
this this trims. It's an elegant UI that prunes information back down to the human scale. Allows you to
Right.
have a
So
conversation with something rather than sit there 5 years listening to everything.
right. You can follow a particular thread. If you're interested, say for This Week in Science, if we were to create this kind of thing, you could follow all of the synthetic biology stories that we've covered for the last 20 more plus years. All of the, or whatever. What does Justin think about this kind of thing? What does Blair think about pandas? Like we could answer these, the AI could very specifically lead to answers and then references within our content blocks that could answer these questions for people. But I like this as the co-creation and like the content destruction, or the ability we're creating the content, which might be long in terms of a podcast. And some people take the time because of their commute or their work habits or whatever it is to sit and watch and listen and take advantage of that time. Other people listen to it at 1.5, 2 times so they can get through it faster, but they want the whole thing. Other people want the small answers, they want the clips. And so being able to use AI to be able to represent ourselves in an accurate way, authentic way, I think is going to be very important. Um, I do worry though about the ethics of AI moving forward generally, and just how we talk about it. Like the majority of people have taken on the idea of just AI, and we've said it: AI, 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 AI. What the artificial intelligence, AI? That means nothing. Like honestly, it has become a meaningless term. And what is your feeling about how and whether, as science communicators, we need to be more specific when we talk about things as not artificial intelligence, like, oh, Elon Musk says because he's pushing Grok and blah, blah, blah. By the end of this year, we're going to have a human level intelligent AI. Well, machine learning, large language model, whatever. Like, do you think we should be using more specific terminology for these specific uses?
I
Do
mean,
you
I am a lifelong proponent of using the most specific language one possibly can, and within the constraints of the conversation that you have to have, right? Like I had a
Right.
University of Utah philosophy professor T. Nguyen on Future Fossils for episode 175. And one of the things that he and I talk about is how actually, it's funny. Doug Engelbart in one of his uh, the founding papers on modern communication. Actually, no, sorry, it was J.C.R. Licklider and Bob Taylor talk about
Look
how
at you remembering
scale.
names and
I just
referencing
read
things. I'm
JCR
so
and
proud of
Licklider
you.
and Bob Taylor, who helped found personal computing and the internet. If you go back and read Mitch Waldrop's history, The Dream Machine, really interesting story
Oh,
about the world that we're living in now.
Mitch is
Um,
great. I love Mitch. I know
right.
him. He's
Yeah. So
fantastic.
he's a fabulous science historian. Anyway, yes, the Licklider and Taylor talk about how scaling destroys communication. And when I had T. Nguyen on the show, we talked about how this creates a problem in science communication, a very fundamental problem in science communication, because experts uh, and non-experts, basically, it's the expert identification problem. You don't know
Yep.
how to identify an expert,
There it
and
is. Mhm.
if you're not yourself an expert.
Yep.
And so this is not just about climate science. This is not just about epidemiology. This is about Bob, Joe Bob down the street and his cow, and you're not an expert in his cow. This is an n-dimensional problem. It has to do with local information sampling and local bias, and the fact that everyone's forming unique models based on their experience. And so when it comes to communication, I think that what happens is when you, again, this is to the point of like why it's useful to have language models that are, or any AI models generally. They don't have to be based on text. Are It's important to have access to systems that allow you to train models on limited data sets, because what you have with ChatGPT is something that's spitting out statistical averages in the same way that when you listen to pop radio, like top 40 pop music, is just the lowest common denominator of what everybody likes. And
Oh my
again, like,
gosh. The late
so
'80s, night like Casey Kasem's Top 40.
right,
Oh my
right, and then
gosh.
No, I mean, say what
Solid
we will.
gold. Oh my gosh.
Right. I mean, there
It's hap
are problems
yeah,
about Spotify just giving you what you want to hear, but it's a different order of problem than being forced to listen to the same 5 songs as everyone else all day every day. And so when it comes to communication, your question about how, like, how granular should we be in the language depends a lot on the
yeah,
scale at which we're attempting to communicate. So it's like if I'm talking to you, like right now, I'm painfully aware that I'm talking to a lot of people I don't know, and I'm
right.
probably
You're
saying
talking
things
to
that I'm going to have
me,
to
but
go
you're
back and
talking to a lot of
explain
people.
later.
Yeah.
Right, and this is a huge issue with this was the issue that Licklider and Taylor were pointing to in communication in their in their work on computer assisted communication, because what they were saying was they weren't using the term AI at the time, but their vision for the future of computing was that computers will one day help us translate our mental models in ways that are instantly legible to people with very different sets of life experience. So like Google Translate is
Oh,
just the very
yeah.
beginning of what we're going to see. We don't have this right now. We're
Okay,
right on the
so okay.
cusp of being able to have this where, as where we will be able to use metaphors that go through some kind of conversion pipeline. So like if like you were saying a moment ago, like if somebody wants this podcast to be a book, it'll be a
Mhm.
book because that's the way that they absorb information best.
Yeah.
If I use an analogy that doesn't make sense to somebody, my personal AI diamond will adjust that in a handshake, an encrypted handshake with that person's AI diamond.
You are
And
like the bird fluttering its feathers to say, "No, you go first." You'll
right,
understand that because the algorithm will understand the feather fluttering and tell
exactly.
you,
And that
"No,
person
you
might
go
be a
first." It's
dolphin
the
communicating with
ultimate
sound
babble
and
fish. Yeah.
exactly. And actually, it's funny because bringing up Peter Watts, Watts makes a very similar case in his follow-up to Blindsight, the book called Echopraxia, where he's got a spaceship full of scientists, and he says every one of them speaks a language with a speaking population of one.
Yes.
And in a weird, and
Oh
it's like
my
a kind of a scary
gosh.
future, but it is
No,
the
it is the
future.
reality right
It is the
now.
logical conclusion of this process, because evolution is a process whereby through the exploitation of every available niche and the recombinant production of new niches, we end up in we're serving maximal entropy production. That's what it means to order the internal components of a system, is it's exporting disorder. And so what do you get? You get a fractal distribution where at the edges of, like in an extremely complex social environment like New York City, you have orders of magnitude more jobs, more occupational niches. And so, as human society becomes larger and larger, and our technological infrastructure becomes deeper and deeper, we're going to end up in situations where we're capable of being a speaking population of one, and and
And not being able to
reliant.
communicate with anybody else because your language is so specific. And when you look at the idea of, what words people share, the 6th grade lexicon is, a thousand, few thousand words, right? You get to end of high school, go up an order of magnitude. Bachelor's degree, graduate school, suddenly you're up to like, 20,000, maybe, the more you specialize, the more specific language you use. You end up having 50, 60,000 potential words in your brain for very specific things. But nobody else, except for that one person who also studies the thing that you study, is going to have all of those words in their brain. And that's why academic communications are so different from the communications to any other population of people. But as we're doing this, as you're discussing this, we're gonna this is the way academia kind of works. It's niche, 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 niche. Everybody specialize, 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 specialize. But you have to have people who are interdisciplinary, because when you end up on a spaceship of, 10 people, you have to be an engineer and a scientist and you know, also somebody who can do language and pilot a ship all at the same time, which is, similar to our current astronauts, cosmonauts, whomever. But I don't know. I think this is fascinating, because what you're talking about is that with artificial intelligence, it will allow humanity to follow, and those individuals who want to follow their goals of certain specific instances to their, as far as they can take them, it'll allow that to be more possible, as opposed to um, because the AI will be able to communicate those specific things to other groups of people in a better way, based on context, once context is understood. And right now, within the entire science communication, like academic community and professional community, people are like, dude, oh my God, we got to worry about like how to talk to different people in different ways. And so now, like, if you're people who are training scientists how to talk about their work, they're like, no, you cannot just say the same thing all the time. People aren't going to understand it.
That was my purgatory for 4.5
Right?
years at the Santa Fe Institute, as you know.
You're not going to
That I
get
mean,
it.
it's funny again, I don't mean to keep leaning on this book, but in Blindsight, Peter Watts,
It's a
the
great book.
character you follow in that book is Siri Keaton. Siri, like the Apple AI assistant, uh, or rather just assistant. But at any rate, Siri Keaton is basically the science communicator for the scientific first contact mission, and is stuck in the position of having to translate between scientists with radically different transhuman brain anatomies. And so he's making a kind of a caricature of our situation, but it's a very plausible caricature. And of course, all of the scientists think that he might be a spy, and you get into exactly the same kind of problem that we're talking
I'm
about, which is
sorry, you
expert
can talk to too
identification.
many. Yeah, you can talk to too many people. You've got to be a spy.
Right, right. And it's funny because, it's something I think about a lot with respect to the kind of translational work that you and I do is Brian Eno. Because like I make ambient electroacoustic guitar music for
I'm a huge
fun.
fan.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Music for
And
airports.
yeah, Eno is a huge inspiration. And Eno said back in the 90s, Eno and Kelly and a couple others that have come up in the course of this were members of the Long Now Foundation, where I worked for a while, thinking about long-term thinking, long time cycles. Anyway, Eno, who coined the term the long now and the big here, as prompts to get people to think on a larger scale. Uh, said in 1995 in an interview with Kelly for Wired magazine that the in the 21st century, the dominant art form would become curation, because as network technologies take over, each of us finds ourselves in this position of intermediation. We find ourselves as the node on some path across the network, and every one of us is responsible for translation to some degree in our lives. The network doesn't really have an edge. We've closed the frontier of geographic exploration around the world. Some of
Yeah.
us, as my friend Stephen Phipps in college said, no man is an island, but some of us are very long peninsulas, meaning that you're at the edge of the
You're right.
statistical distribution. You
Yeah.
study worm sex or whatever, but like nonetheless, all of us are living in the network. And so, yeah, I mean, this is not the answer to your question. The answer to your question is AI uselessly vague? And I think that it is. Jaron
Yeah.
Lanier said as much. He said that using the word AI makes conversation about this more of a religion than anything else. And
Yep.
and I
It makes it
completely agree.
easier for people like the head of OpenAI to like do his marketing speak. Like I've seen so many things. If I'm blanking on his name because I've purposefully been trying to forget it. But What's his
Sam
name?
Altman.
Sam Altman says
Yeah.
this is the best thing to do. Sam Altman says we need nuclear fusion to be able to do the energy for the AI. Sam Altman says these are the 9 things you should eat to be healthy today. Sam Altman says this is what you should read today. I'm like, this is one of those things where my mind is like, I'm done because the marketing
Mm.
speak is taking over and the sensationalism of all of it is, like I said, it's um, turning it into meaningless, right? It doesn't mean AI means nothing.
Well, you've hit the other, it's carrying capacity, right? And
Yeah.
that's the thing is like as a quote unquote paleontologist futurist, I've spent most of my adult life critiquing this Ray Kurzweil kind of exponential extrapolation into infinity, right? I was
Hmm.
like, sorry, I took ecology 101 and I know about this thing called carrying capacity and negative feedback and natural limits. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that I have a lot of friends that are kind of like degrowther types that believe that we've crossed the
Years
carrying
ago,
capacity of our planet, but
oh
that's
yeah, years ago that came out
right.
as an
1971 limits to
right.
growth.
Yeah.
But here's the thing is that the singularitarians have it partially correct because back when I was at SFI, I interviewed Mingzhen Liu, who is studied. I love that you brought up being a rhizomal network, mycorrhizae of podcast
Right.
world.
Yes.
Mingzhen Liu studies the evolution of plant fungi symbiosis and mycorrhizal affiliation. And in the conversation that he and I had for Complexity Podcast episode 80, uh,
Do you
that
did you just have those like episodes and interviews on the top of your head? Like you just
yes, which is why it's always better to talk to me than it is to talk to the bot. But
okay,
but I
keep
mean,
going. My brain is
anyway,
so
yeah. So
different.
Mingzhen and I talked about how there was a time that the Carboniferous period, a lot of the fossil fuel deposits that we have today exist in because of algae, but a lot of them exist because there were millions of years where the terrestrial ecosystems of Earth were were characterized by fallen logs that nothing knew how to eat. There was nothing in the
There's
world that could
nothing there to
digest
no
lignin.
decomposers.
Right, no decomposers. And so
Yeah,
and you go back even further, and this is something I've been thinking about for much longer
that's
than
awesome.
since I talked to Ming Zhen. But like the great oxidation event of 2.2 billion years ago was an atmospheric industrial pollution catastrophe.
Yeah.
So like if you talk about AI, like the thing that I like to do is say,
Yes.
okay, well, this word is let's give this word more meaning by deconstructing what it means to be artificial even more than we already have. So artificial intelligence doesn't mean the specific thing. Artificial intelligence could mean the intelligence that is the result of the agency of some other kind of intelligence. And arguably, therefore, one might conclude that the atmosphere that we take for granted as
Is artificial
natural
to the planet
it was engineered, however
by
unwittingly, by
by what
cyanobacteria and the microorganisms that had to evolve an oxygen based metabolism in order to adapt to an overproduction of oxygen. And so,
Yes, everything is that you are breaking my double-stranded DNA in my hippocampus right now. Oh my god. But yes, everything is that kind of adaptation, right? They're like you talked about, they're the phase transitions, right? There are points at which conditions change that lead to it's we can call it an opportunity, but it's also necessity. If something is going to survive, it is necessary, not just sufficient for that organism to continue doing something in a particular way or to adapt to a different way, which leads to new speciation and the mutation and the evolution of through complexity, right? That you
right.
have the randomness, you have the complexity. Certain things work in certain situations, don't work in other situations, but you have that multiplicity of factors that all come together to push in a particular direction. Nothing would be the way it is without the way it was, right? But we call it natural now. People on marketing stuff, they call it organic or natural, quote unquote. But
Well, there's Douglas
yeah,
Adams said that, it was like, uh, what he said, every new technology invented after the age of 35 is against the natural order. Like anything invented when you're a kid is just like, I mean,
oh,
like,
it's just your
but
invention. It's what you're
right,
doing.
right, right,
Yeah.
right. So, in that sense, there is no such thing as the supernatural. There may be all kinds of weird stuff that we would currently characterize as supernatural. And I find that sort of, fringe science I find very fascinating for that reason, because we have very good reason to maintain epistemic humility at a time when knowledge production is so incredibly over the top that you know everyone is having a hard time keeping track of what we know.
Okay.
But yeah,
Yeah, and on that, I want to ask you, as someone who is asking questions and wants to cross different intellectual field barriers for creativity, for philosophy, for also knowledge and intellectual advancement. Like, how do you balance the fact that there is so much manipulation and misuse of information that's out there with the ultimate like humanity of knowledge creation and the fact that you have to be creative and you have to allow for pushing barriers in the process of creating new knowledge, especially as someone who communicates science.
yeah. I mean, well, I'm off the hook now. I'm no longer tethered to an
Doing
institution.
it right, right.
I have
You're
I've
you're on your
internalized
own.
I've internalized the superego of the Santa Fe Institute now, and now Future Fossils is a different show than it was in 2018 when I started working there. Now I'm much more careful about the kind of stuff that I entertain. And
Right.
in fact, if you go Future Fossils episode 186 is my manifesto for weird science, and I, this is where I say we you know we need to be careful. I forget her name. Here's your forgetting. Right? I spoke a couple years ago in an SFI working group with a University of Colorado philosophy professor whose name I forget, and I'm sorry. But she said, we have to be careful about premature ontological closure. Like the more you know, the better you get at convincing yourself
That
of
you know
whatever it is that
everything.
you are politically motivated to believe. Stuff to Blow Your Mind did a great episode on this about the politics ridden mind.
Yeah.
Um, and
My
and
favorite
so
my favorite quote is from I always forget things. Anyway, my favorite quote, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." So
yes,
it just is so specific, but also it's just a reminder that like the more you learn, the less you know. And I mean, I honestly think that my PhD was ultimately important to me because that is the most important thing it taught me.
mm,
There were always more things to learn. There
I
were
think it had a different
no
effect on you than it
specific
has a
answers.
lot on a lot of PhD students.
No, no,
Because at some point you
it's
become
me.
politically motivated to believe that you're an expert. And, Murray Gell-Mann used to talk about, I mean, so like Michael Crichton was friends with Murray Gell-Mann. And Crichton coined this term, the Gell-Mann amnesia, which is when you read an article in the newspaper on a topic that you are well acquainted with, and you realize the journalists don't know what they're talking about. But then you turn the page and you're reading an article about a different topic, and you immediately forget that what you're reading is not the canonical truth about some situation. And so I think that this is, if I'm going to recommend one extremely weird piece of reading to your listeners to help them understand where my head's at with this question of, how do we stay grounded in a time that is so vertiginous and in certain ways, really quite scary, because the bottom has fallen out of consensual, of consensus reality. Like
Reality.
Friedrich
Yeah.
Nietzsche, talked about that. That when he was saying God is dead, he wasn't bragging. He was pointing into the epistemic abyss of nihilism and the existential abyss of what does it mean now that we've crossed into the realm where there be tigers and dragons, and we no longer have this mythic envelope, the uterus, or I mean the placenta of Christianity to protect Western science. What does this mean to stand
Our
for?
placenta's full of microplastics now, jeez.
Oh God. So exactly. Well, I mean, that's the whole thing. Um,
I know.
but there are bacteria now evolving to eat the plastics, right? So there's
Yeah.
hope, and
That's
that's the
what I
Ming
always
Zhen Lu
say.
hope.
Curiosity,
Close the circle.
just bring it in.
But so
Yes.
yeah, so this story that I want to recommend people as sort of street cred. Uh, I wrote this thing in 2017 called "An Oral History of the End of Reality." It was right after I saw Adobe give the first product demo for their new voice cloning software, where you could at that time, it was a 2-minute sample of someone's voice and then create something that sounded like a reasonable approximation of that person. You could type in words and it come out sounding like and now this is a retail consumer product and you only need like 3 seconds or something
Six.
to
I think it's
well,
6
it was five.
seconds, or it
The
may be shorter now, but yeah.
Yeah, the Google, yeah, it was 5 as of 2020. But I mean, so this is one of these, William Gibson says the future is already here. It's just distributed unevenly. Who can really stay on top of everything? I tried for a little while staying on top of AI news, and it's impossible. Yeah, so this story is is about the collapse of social epistemology that we are living through right now in 2024, an era of where the arms race between our ability to synthesize convincing forgeries that trick those of us that are used to relying on photographic or videographic evidence as what York University professor Regina Rini calls the epistemic backstop of
Yep.
the last 150 years. That's gone.
If you can
And
see it, you can know it, right? That's gone.
right, right. And
Yeah.
so and this is only going to progress. And so there's this arms race now between counterfeiting and forgery. And what are we left with? Like, what is the evolutionary game theoretical, uh, equilibrium that if you run this long enough, where does it leave us? And it was interesting because like a lot of the people who read the story wrote to me and they were just terrified,
Mhm.
but a couple people who
It's
read the story
scary.
realized that where I see it taking us is back into this acceptance that if you come out of, like as you did, if you come out of scientific training with a well adapted to uh, to the scientific process rather than just assuming you're an expert for status primate reasons, um, then you become much more careful about the way that you state a claim. And so, what I saw is, and what I think I'm starting to see with people working in this space are starting to devise human computer chimerae. Like my friend Nicholas Brigham Adams at Goodley Labs, who he's a social scientist who leads a group of people working on human AI collective intelligence scaffolds. Um, I interviewed him on Future Fossils a couple episodes ago, and we talked about, rest in peace, Daniel Kahneman, who came up with
No,
that,
just
thinking fast
yes.
and slow, system one and system
Oh,
two
so yeah,
thinking. So like, okay,
yeah.
what we have
Good
now on the
news.
internet is like reflex thinking. What we need is executive function. We need a planet scale prefrontal cortex, and so what I kind of imagine and what I hint at in An Oral
Hmm.
History at the End of Reality is that we develop more nuanced ways that might include uh, um, that make use of the fact that the internet is dynamic in its presentation. You know
Mhm.
that we're not so much of science
And
journalism
chaotic.
now is still operating in a regime where it's like you have a hammer press with fixed type, and we're worried that you can go back and you can change what this stuff says. But actually, what we need to be able to represent knowledge in a way that is itself adaptive to the extraordinary pace at which new knowledge is produced, and also it communicates the uncertainty with which scientists are actually making their claims. So like
Huge.
if you had a high p value in your research, maybe the typeface in which this news is reported would be blurrier in the places where there's greater levels of statistical uncertainty in the results, and they would come into focus as you're saying something that the researchers are more confident in saying. And so this is, there's going to be many, many, many different ways that we address this issue, but I'm actually rather hopeful, because
Hmm.
as someone who has been, who basically fell on the sword of institutional science communication, I
That's
want
right. What am
better
I
ways.
doing? Oh.
Right, I dream of better ways for us to communicate honestly with one another,
Yeah.
where you feel that you know something for sure and where you're hesitant to report your findings, instead of like
Yeah.
the way that we see this stuff in, sensationalist ad revenue attention economy science journalism, which is
Headlines. Click, click,
this
click,
is the
click.
new reality, adapt. And it's creating
Yeah.
this problem that, which is that people say, like, believe the science, and it's like, no, 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 that's a very
So
14th century way
right,
of
so
talking
there's
about
2
this.
different like, there's now, like, you talk about game theory, I think, in the internet with respect to scientific information, I have an open mind. I am I have an open mind, so, of course, I'm still asking questions, and no one knows. I don't know, no one knows. I still what versus believe the science, which is, like, the other side of it. So, I think that there is something to be addressed there in terms of the information distribution related to science on the internet. I mean, maybe just misinformation and information itself generally, but, I think the point also that you brought up about uncertainty is something that we need to address more and more often. There are studies that support the idea that people need to understand that science has uncertainty, and that most results, majority of results are not certain, that there is a distribution, right? There we have significance, and then we also have uh, standards of error around that. But that's the statistics, right? People don't like the broader general public. They look at the headline and they go, "Oh, okay, great, got it. Now I know
If
the
you
news."
program, if you are a coder in the audience, let's talk, because what I want to see are different overlays. Data visualization. I want to see a heat map on a scientific article. You can see this now with gaze tracking in the Apple Vision Pro and this kind of thing. You can see how long someone's eyes lingered on a particular, the décolletage of some swimsuit model.
Oh
What I
gosh.
want to see is uh, I want to see a heat map for the relative degrees of uncertainty of different statements made in a scientific
Mm.
paper. I want to see, for instance,
Or
and this
not
would be
even just
actually
scientific papers, but like the media that's going on.
right.
So that, as you're looking at your phone browser or your computer browser, if you have allowed this to be measured, then this data, your webcam will be measuring where your eyes are, right, on the screen for a particular amount of time. What are you paying attention to? What are you looking at? And then is there a poll that you can take at the end of those articles or whatever you're looking at that determines um, your sensory aspects or like how you feel about whatever it is.
So yeah, you can do like Peter Sheridan Dodds at the University of Vermont again,
Yeah.
uses Twitter timeline data, time series data analysis to study sentiment change over time. The
That
way
was the word I was
he
looking
has
for.
yeah, he has really interesting tools online that you can see the frequencies of different words in a population of words on Twitter and see how they change over time and see how they change relative to one another. And you can track happiness in terms of like you can track the emotional thermometer of Twitter over more than a decade. And but even more so, like,
And we're not happy generally.
oh no, it has gone precipitously
It's
down
gone
since
down.
2015.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a question of how much of
Uh,
that, how what. So that's where
what
that's where
is
you can start to
happiness?
form
What is the
the
sentiment?
hypothesis. What does
Yeah.
it mean
Yeah.
for us to have, like, we know that these correlations are real. Now what? But even more
Mhm.
so, like, it would take very little. I'm really fascinated by this approach in the digital humanities called topic modeling, which studies clusters of associated uh, concepts by taking, for instance, my I've had a number of conversations with Simon Dedeo at Carnegie Mellon University about this. He looks at the French parliamentary papers. He looks at the history of the proceedings of the Royal Society, and I find his work and like the work of Lauren Klein, who looks at she wrote a book with Catherine D'Ignalio called Data Feminism that looks at things like the abolitionary newspapers and tracks the contributions of Black and female authors who are writing under aliases, or like, we now
Who
know have
had to
given their
write under
ideas.
aliases
Exactly,
because
but
otherwise they would not have been accepted. Yeah.
we could track the ideas that were coming up
Mm.
with people that were not being given credit for them at the time, and we can actually see where the innovations were being made in culture. And I think that you could do something, it would be very easy given the methods that we have now, that we've had for years, to do something similar with scientific publication, or and then we could put that into science reporting, where you can see how long something has been a fact. That you could see the patina of of the depth of empirical validation
That
for an
in
idea.
that is interesting. That I am interested in that and how that could be utilized, um, for not just for scientists themselves, for the direction of research that they're taking, but also for communicators and how things are communicated, and also to help people understand what is consensus versus a new idea versus, this is quote unquote just theory.
If you have money and you're listening to this, fund
Yeah,
me and Kiki to put
yeah,
together a team of software developers
I
who will
love it.
change scientific communication
Oh my
for
god,
the
I love it.
better for millions
Oh,
and millions of people. We can
ugh.
revolutionize the way that people understand the process of knowledge construction, and we can make our society a much, much safer place because people will not be arguing over as many of the wrong things anymore.
Oh my gosh. Like, yes. Yes, 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 yes. Like, how can we use the tools that we have today to enhance and improve the way that we co create the future, right? We have the tools now. We're going to create the tools of the future, but we have to work it to make it work better moving forward. And yes, funding, please. I think that we can do this.
And in fact, like
I
I
mean,
said,
honestly, I'm like, oh my gosh, I love it.
I know the people that could be building these models. It's just a matter of finding the means to hire them.
Yeah.
So,
Let me
I
just
mean,
talk to Rita Allen. I'll see
right.
what Rita Allen wants to do.
I mean, there are a lot of people that, I mean, this is a concern. We live in the so-called post-truth era, but that was a premature diagnosis. That was premature in the same way that people diagnosed postmodernism in the middle of the 20th century, and we are, by all accounts, still quite firmly embedded in the modern era.
Yes.
Um, Anyway,
We are not yet post-truth. We are not ein end stage capitalism, possibly, probably, but, yeah, we diagnose ourselves very early, but there are ways that we can use our resources and our knowledge and collaborate for the better. Michael, you have just been amazing to talk to, and it's been a couple of hours. So, as much as I want to keep speaking with you about all of these things, we need to bring the show to a close. So, you have mentioned your podcast and other things, but where can people find out about things that you're working on? And is there anything like specifically right now that you want to let people know about that's going to be coming up?
I mean, certainly, like I said, I'm trying to find time to write a book about all of this stuff. Future Fossils is ongoing. I am uh, making do with a day job for a really interesting computing nonprofit that I can't really talk about yet, but
Oh,
uh,
secrets. That's
it
cool.
is. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of this stuff comes out of research that I've background research I've been doing for a team of, if I'm going to put my money on a horse, as far as what it means to have a much healthier paradigm for computing and for human computer symbiosis. But no, I would just say, look, get in touch with me if you find this stuff interesting. um, I have a link tree, Michael Garfield, with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about up top. But yeah, I mean, I'm co-facilitating a course on technology ethics later this spring. What does it mean to wield these kinds of technologies in a responsible way? Um, I I have an album coming out right now, week by week. I really thank you for
Right. Week
riffing
by
together.
week.
This was great. Yeah. No, I mean, I spent 20 years on this thing, but the right way to release it these days is apparently as a drip. That's the way you maximize attention capture surface area. So, you know, yeah, that's the course, Embodied Ethics in the Age of AI, with uh, co-produced by Andrew Dunn, who's the former innovation head for the Center for Humane Technology, Tristan Harris's organization.
Mhm.
And we've got, yeah. So I mean, there's just a lot. There's a lot at any time, but I'm always looking for another interesting team to be a part of, and I'm happy to speak with anyone who thinks I can help them navigate the what my friend and mentor Eric Davis called global weirding. So
It is it is a
yeah,
weird time, and we find ourselves in it, and if we can work together and talk to each other as we go through it, perhaps it will not seem as lonely, and maybe the weird will be the good kind of weird instead of the kind of weird that you're like, I don't know if I really like this very much. So,
I hope so. I'm here to help. Last thing I'll say
I,
about this, and
yeah,
this is me being truly weird, but
bring
as
it. I
someone who
like the
thinks
weird. I'm a
as
weirder.
someone who thinks in networks about networks, across networks of networks, uh, one of the ideas that I'm playing with that I want to explore in this book, Jurassic Worlding, that I need to find a publisher for and pitch, um, is
Side note, if there's anybody out there who wants to
yes.
write.
Are you a publisher? I need an
Anyway.
advance. Yes. No. The idea is that the the network map of the internet as it has developed over time looks rather similar to uh, maps of functional connectivity in the human brain under the influence of psychedelics. And like what you found through studies in
And not like the
Imperial
spider
College,
webs of spiders on psychedelics.
right, right. Well, there's that whole thing too, which is hilarious.
Yeah,
A very
yeah,
fascinating kind of bedroom study on the
yeah.
extended cognition. But No, there's the research that's been done on psilocybin in the brain at Imperial College London shows that uh, that psychedelics relax the inhibition of crosstalk between brain regions, and in a similar way, the evolution of of our communications technology infrastructure um, can be kind of seen as this same kind of process with the same kind of promise and the same kind of peril. And so if you lean too far in one direction, if you connect things too much, you get cascading bank failures and the spread of zoonotic plagues and proliferation of disinfo and all of these other things.
That's
Um,
the bad place.
right. So, like, to
Take
your
me to the
point
good
about, like,
place.
where is the level,
Yeah.
this question of how connected should we be, how much information should be moving through, from one part of the system to another. um, this is a question that I find very fascinating. But my friends who work in the festival world, we started talking about Burning Man. My friends
Yeah.
who work at Burning Man in the Zendo, which is the harm reduction center where people go when they're having a bad time,
Mhm.
um, I they have my years long friendship with them has given me a metaphor that I find very useful to me in thinking about how to help people make sense of an age of exponential technological change, which is that we are basically living in some kind of way. We are living through something like a planet scale psychedelic experience. And the question is, how can we make it a good trip? Or if we are having a bad trip, how can we help someone integrate that experience so that it at least
Mm.
becomes a valuable lesson? Don't burn out, folks.
Oh, thank you. Okay. I'm just
Thank you.
yes. I'm gonna take that. I'm giving you claps. That I love that as a take home message for the night. Yeah. Just how can we turn it into a good trip? How can we help the people who are having a bad trip? How can we make this trip really, really that transformative experience that a psychedelic trip can? And I don't know, don't want to judge, but should possibly be. Don't doesn't necessarily have to be. Ah, Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight here on This Week in Science. And I will share your link tree. It's going to be at our twist.org show notes. It'll be on our website. It'll be shared in our social media after the fact. And all the information about stuff that we talked about. Do you have anything else that you need us to know? Links, anything else that we should have? No?
I mean, that's the beautiful thing about the web as it currently exists, right? Is that you actually don't need the links. You just know where to find me because you just
Yeah.
do the
You
thing.
just do the thing
Oh,
and you
that
find and
guy,
you know.
Michael Garfield, although unfortunately,
There's
through some
probably other Michael Garfields out there, and then they
the
get
weird
confused.
twist,
And
the weird twist is that there is a radio personality in Houston, Michael Garfield, who reports on technology for iHeartRadio. He's the high tech Texan, and for all the years that I was living in Austin,
but that's
Texas,
not you.
I was like, "What is this? What weird? Like, what is this actually? What's in a name? Like how Dennis's are more likely than would be expected from a random, from like a normal distribution
Oh my
to become
gosh.
dentists.
Name
Laura's are more
statistics.
likely than would be randomly expected to become
Mhm.
lawyers. So, what is
Mhm.
it about Michael
Mhm.
Garfield that says you're going to be talking about technology? I don't know.
It's probability, man. It's all
Might be
statistics.
spurious.
Yes. You might be an outlier. I don't know. Oh my goodness. Everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of This Week in Science. Michael, thank you once again for joining us. Everybody, Future Fossils podcast. If you are interested in hearing more of Michael talking with all these people that he has named and referenced throughout the show about all these interesting topics and more, He has many episodes, and his Substack is really awesome. Not just the podcast. There's a lot of writing, and there's a lot of other stuff, and his music, and so much out there. Oh my gosh. Michael, we need to connect more because these ideas are amazing. You made my brain happy. And
our collaboration is as destined as multicellularity given the thermodynamic gradient.
There we go. Particular things have to happen to make it work, but then all of a sudden, there it goes. Exactly. Everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. All of you, chat rooms, thank you for being here, chatting, Discord, YouTube, Facebook, Twitch. Thank you for all of your comments and all of your ideas throughout the conversations that we've had tonight. I would love to give shout outs also to Fada for his help with social media and show notes, Gord, Arnlor, others who help keep our chat rooms really nice places to hang out. Thank you for making sure that happens. Identity 4, thank you for recording the show. And Rachel, thank you for your editing. And of course, as always, I do need to thank our Patreon sponsors. So without further ado, thank you to Aaron Anathema, Arthur Kepler, Craig Potts, Mary Gertz, Teresa Smith, Richard Badge, Bob Coles, Kent Northrop, George Chorus, Pierre Velazarb, John Ratnaswamy, Chris Wozniak, Vigard Shefstad, Donathan Styles, a.k.a. Don Stylo, Ali Coffin, Reagan Shoe, Brood, Sarah Forfar, Don Mundus, P.I.G. Starrett, Stephen Albaran, I Can't Talk Tonight, Daryl Myshak, Andrew Swanson, Fredis104, Sky Luke, Paul Ronovich, Kevin Reardon, Noodles, Jack, Brian Carrington, David and Youngblood, Sean Clarence Lamb, John McKee, Greg Riley, Mark Hessenflow, Steve Leisman, a.k.a. Zima, Ken Hayes, Howard Tan, Christopher Rabin, Richard, Brendan Minish, Johnny Ridley, Harmy Day, Flying Out, Christopher Dreyer, Greg Briggs, John Atwood, Rudy Garcia, Dave Wilkinson, Rodney Lewis, Paul Rick Remus, Philip Shane, Kurt Larson, Craig Landon, Sue Doster, Jason Olds, Dave Neighbor, Eric Knapp, Lon Makes, E.O., Adam Mishkan, Kevin Parachan, Aaron Luthen, Bob Calder, Marjorie Paul D. Disney, David Simmerly, Patrick Pecoraro, and Tony Steele. Thank you for all of your support on Patreon. I really, really cannot do all of this without you. And if any of you out there are interested in helping us out by supporting on Patreon, head over to twis.org and click on that Patreon link. On next week's show, I'm going to be back again at 8 p.m. Pacific time. Woo! Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, get ready. It'll be live once again. Want to listen to the podcast? Just look for This Week in Science wherever podcasts are found. And if you enjoyed the show, of course, get your friends to subscribe too for more information, links to stories, etc. Head over to twis.org and also sign up for our newsletter, which we occasionally actually send out because it's kind of me and I'm not good at that. Anyway, I love your feedback. If there's a topic that you want me to cover, us to cover, suggestion for an interview, let me know on social media or send me an email. Put TWIS in the subject line, however, so that your email doesn't get spam filtered into an AI algorithm, just turning it into a hallucination and that doesn't really go anywhere and isn't real anyway. So just put it there in the TWIS subject line. That's how I'll know that you're talking to me. And we look forward to discussing science with you again next week because, we're going to be back again. And if you learned anything, remember, it's all in your head.
This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science, it's the end of the world. So I'm setting up shop, got my banner unfurled. It says the scientist is in, I'm gonna sell my advice. Show them how to stop the robots with a simple device. I'll reverse global warming with a wave of my hand. And all it'll cost you is a couple of grand. 'Cause this week's science is coming your way. So everybody listen to what I say. I use the scientific method for all that it's worth. And I'll broadcast my opinion all over the earth. 'Cause 'cause it's This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. 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 This Week in 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 Science.